Hi there, my name is Sarah Big and I will giving you a tutorial on how to make a mold. Today we are making a business card holder. We are going to use a mold made out of clay, which will be fired to a bisque ware. That mold will be used repetitively to create more of the product. Alright, now we have the tools laid out for us. The tools that we have here is our needle, a flat kidney, metal kidney, a craft knife, and a ruler for our measurements, and a dull stick. I'll be showing you guys step by step why we need each tool. Alright, the clay that we're using is terracotta clay, which is a stoneware high temp clay. The metal pole that we use is our roller to flatten our clay. And we have a toolbox just for extra tools in case we might need it. And we always have a bucket of water with our cloth and a sponge. Right, so we have our lump of clay that we're going to wedge out. There are two different techniques that you can use for wedging out clay. There's this one technique that you use that is similar to wedging out bread dough. And then there's one that is called the bullhorn wedge technique, where you turn it on its side and round again, up, round, and down. Because then at some point when you're done wedging, you get some type of bullhorn pattern. And the purpose for wedging out our clay is to get rid of all those air pockets and air lumps, and that is to prevent any explosions in the kiln when it goes to its bisquing firing process. The time that you should take into wedging is at least a minute, which is like you count 60 seconds into wedging your clay. It's also about 60 times that you're wedging out all that air pockets out. So that should be enough for getting all that air pockets out. And if you're unsure, if you're not certain that your air pockets are all cut out, you take a piece of wire and just cut it in the middle, and you separate the two pieces of clay to see if there's any air pockets, which I'll do now. So we have our wire. Slice it through. No air pockets. Awesome. And just slam that closed. And go back into wedging those two pieces together. All right, once your clay is wedged out, it should be ready for slabbing. All right, before we go into our slabbing, we must make sure that our surface is clean and clear. So we just wipe that away. We wait for this surface to be dry, otherwise the clay will stick to the surface. All right. Now the next step that we're going to do is have our dowel sticks ready. This is to manage the thickness of our clay as we're rolling our rolling pin out, which is this object. All right, I have that ready. Now we take our wedged out clay and we're going to just slab it against the table. You can slap it until you get more or less of a rectangle shape. Then you're just going to drag it across the table until it stretches with the table. You're literally slapping the clay against the table so it can stretch out. Now that we have a decent slabbed out piece, we bring our 2 dowel sticks, place it against a piece of clay. And we have our rolling pin, and we just press it down. The dowel sticks are there to stop the rolling pin from going any further than 1 centimeter, which is the thickness of the dowel stick. Right, we can also change it the other direction. Right, let me just flatten this out again. Yeah, this is why it is important to have a dry surface. But however, I think the clay was too wet and it got stuck to the table, and it happens. These things happen all the time. We'll just smooth out the surface when we are done, but it's really not a big issue. All right, once we got everything even, we can check our thickness by just taking our needle and just quickly draw a line against the clay. You lift that up, you can see an even thickness, and that's because the dowel sticks helped us manage that. All right, the reason why we have 1 centimeter thickness of clay for the slab is for the expansion and the contraction that the glass goes through in the kiln. The glass is placed over the mold, which is the clay, which will be burst, and the mold needs to be a centimeter thick to withstand all the contraction and expansion from the glass. And also this mold will be used repetitively, which means the glass, it's important to be thicker so it can be strong and withstand and last for a longer time. Actually, just spread that water around the clay, just get it all nice and muddy so that moisture can just lock into the clay. We use the metal kidney just to smooth it out. You'll find some cracks on the sides, but that's okay, it will be cut away. Just lift the clay. And lift it this way, bring it up this way, and fold it over like that. Now take the one side, and I'm just going to fold that into the groove, and I just fold it down against the piece of wood that's there. And just fold everything down. Right. Okay, now the next part is just to neaten everything up, square out our mold and let it dry. but that's going to be a whole process on its own. The tools that we can use is a needle. It's pretty simple, or a craft knife. So we're just going to cut against the maquette, which is our guide. All of this can be reused. Just find that wood line. Right, now I need to just straighten out my clay. I sometimes switch in and out with tools according to what suits it better. They do the same purpose, but I switch in and out of tools, which is fine. As you can see, the thickness of the clay has kept its form. Right, I just do the other side. And that's our other side. All right, now before we finish our mold, we need to make sure everything is neat and smooth, because any detail on the ceramic bisqueware will show on the glass. So we use a sponge or a metal kidney. Even a fingerprint detail on the piece of clay will show on the glass. So everything needs to be smooth and clean. Just a bit of water and sponge. Come in with our metal kidney and just flatten all those rough edges, all those imperfections, or impurities, you just smoothen out. Okay, we're just going to use the kidney just to smoothen out all those impurities and imperfections, all the bumps and cracks so we have a smooth, clean surface. Right, once we cleared that out, we can come back to our sponge. Just smoothen out those lines away. We come back with our sponge with a bit of water, and we just smooth out those lines again, the surface of the clay. Make sure you cover the edge of the clay so you don't get any sharp edges when it dries. But as the clay dries into leatherware, you're gonna rub back with the sponge just to clean off the edges again. Now I'm going to cover my mold, my clay, with a piece of plastic so that it can dry off slowly. If it dries too fast, the clay will create warp, it will buckle, and it will crack. So we cover it in plastic to prevent that from happening. Now fast forward 2 or 3 days later, we have our mold ready and dried out. I removed our clay from the maquette, and our clay is now in its leather dry form, meaning that it has a leather texture to it, but it's not completely dry. And it's a bit cold to the touch of the surface. Now, what we're going to do, and there's one thing that you have to remember. With clay, after it's firing, the clay shrink because the clay loses its moisture during its firing process. All right, so before we dry this out completely, we're just going to neaten up the edges and underneath as well. Having a good maintenance over our mold helps the mold to last a lot longer. Okay. So to come in with a damp sponge. I'm just going to smooth out those edges. It's also very important that at this stage, the clay is very delicate, so do not apply too much pressure on the surface, otherwise it will cause cracks and breakage. So be very delicate when working with the clay. If you do tend to find a crack, just take a piece of clay, dry piece of clay. I have some in my bucket. Just wet it a little bit. And just fill in that crack. This is usually called slip. Okay, and just smooth that out. Right, and I'm just going to turn it to its side slowly. Now we can see the impression that the maquette left at the bottom of the clay. And we're just going to clean that up as well. By cleaning both sides of the mold, you can actually use both sides for slumping your glass over. So not just one side, you can use both sides. These marks that we have here are called stretch marks, so you can just take some clay, wet piece of clay, and just rub it in. And just smooth that out. If you look after the mold looks after you. Just watch out for any cracks, because every time you fill out those cracks, it can come back. So every day you must check on your mold as it slowly dries out. Alright guys, now the next step that I'm going to do is drill in 3 holes on the one fold and 3 holes on the other fold. This is just to allow air to escape through the mold, to allow the pressure of the glass to melt over and slump over evenly. And so that we don't get air bubbles. All right. The tool that I'm using has a bit of a screw or a twist into it. It's just to allow pressure into our hole making. And this tool is very handy because you don't need to add a lot of pressure, you just need to twist it down, because our mold at the moment is still at its delicate stage. So we're drilling it like it's a hand drill. And there we go. I have one. Go on to our next fold. Okay, just a reminder that the mold is at a very fragile stage, and just be careful when you're applying your pressure when you're making your holes. Alright, take our needles just to make sure that the airway is clear through those holes. Guys, what this looks like. The holes are there to allow the heat to escape while this glass is slumping over the mold. So that prevents any air pockets and air bubbles. The last and final step for this process is that we let this dry until it's bone dry, meaning to the touch of the surface, there's no moisture and there's no coldness. That's how you know when your mold, your piece of clay is ready to be bisqued. Yeah, that is it. That is the technique on how to make a mold. Hey guys, so now we're going to make Connie's corporate gift card holder, and a few days ago we made a mold which is now currently being bisqued in the kiln. So now we're going to prepare the glass that will just be slumped over. All right. So here is her design, and the measurements that is required is just 21 by 11 centimeters. And the shape of this piece of glass is a simple rectangle, and the mold that the glass will go over will do all the shaping and forming. All right, so let's get into it. First, our PPE for protection from any glass shards flying around. Our terps to lubricate our scoring line, our ruler, a glass cutter, our grouser, happy snapper, and our marker. All right, now we first need to measure out our rectangle. We're going to need a ruler and your marker. So I said 11 by 21. So here's our 11 mark. Sorry? Yes, yes. It's also important to remember that your glass must be smaller than the mold. If it is bigger than the mold, your glass will form over the mold and it will get stuck, and it will cause glass cracks and breakage. So to prevent that from happening, you just measure your glass slightly smaller than the mold. Right. I've measured our width, which is 11 centimeters. This is a big sheet of glass, so we always have to cut through the glass and not halfway in. That prevents breakages and waste. Let's come in with our terps. Glide for our oil line. We apply pressure. And also make sure that your screw is facing up so you know that you're holding it correctly. Apply pressure and you just score down. For big sheets of glass, I prefer not to use the happy snapper. It's always best to turn the sheet around, come with the back of your glass cutter, apply pressure at the edge of the glass where the cut line is. We just tap on that cut line until we see a slight crack along the score line. Turn the glass around and we do the same thing. We should see the crack line lather through. All right, now we come with our two thumbs, and where that crack line went through, we apply pressure just along it, or just in front of it, so that tension can break through the score line. Then you'll hear a nip. Remove that piece. But this is the piece that we need. We remove this piece. Okay. Now we measure our 22 centimeters. Two. Right. Now we just break that apart. Our oil line, apply pressure, score down. This can come with a happy snapper. Always make sure that your happy snapper is facing the correct way. So to ensure that, the screw must be facing up and that middle line must be visible. So now you can see that your score line is in line with that middle line. You hold the glass in the happy snapper, make sure it's in that guideline, you just apply pressure. All right. Just so that I don't get confused, we're not using this piece. So this will be our piece of glass that will be slumped over the mold.
Hi everyone, I'm going to discuss with you the application of applying plaster to your kiln shelves and your molds, and the reason we do this is that to make sure that the glass does not stick to the surface we are using in the kiln. I'm going to be showing the wet application, as in this way when we do a wet application you do not show any texture, it will create a smooth surface. One can also sieve the powdered plaster onto the surface, and this way you'll pick up more a textured surface if that is what you require. But for this technique we want a nice smooth surface for all our molds. What we are going to need is our half-mast respirator, because we don't want to breathe plaster in, as it's rather dangerous for our lungs, as it actually solidifies inside the lungs. We also need a goat hair soft brush, and this is what we're going to use to pick up the water plaster mixture that we're going to create or make, and that's what we're going to use to apply onto our surfaces. We also need a bucket with clean water inside. We do not need much, as well as my other bucket that has plaster. All right, please make sure that your kiln shelf has been cleaned before applying your new mold mix onto the surface, as any old plaster on the surface may create devitrification, which is that crystal milky layer that you find on top of glass, which is rather unappealing. Let me explain to you what I'm going to do first before putting my respirator on, otherwise my sound will be too muffled. So I have a basic water, clean water inside my bucket, and I'm going to sieve a little bit of my plaster into the water. It is important to remember we're not making a mold, so we don't need to apply a lot of plaster. It's a watered down mixture of plaster and water. Okay, I can take my respirator off because all the dust is gone, and I'm going to pick up my brush and I'm going to mix that water and the plaster into each other. As you can see, it's a very watered down water and plaster mixture. All right, so this brush allows us to pick a lot of the water up at a time, to be able to make one brush stroke. Do not go back on itself, as it will lift with the previous plaster that you have just applied. When you put your brush back down in your bucket, remember to go all the way to the bottom, because your plaster will tend to settle at the bottom of this mixture. So you can see I'm applying one direction first, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply in the opposite direction afterwards. And the reason for doing this is to create less brush marks on the surface, because glass is able to pick up the texture that one puts on the surface. I normally do this 3 times. And it's a good idea to do this the day before, because you want the kiln shelf to be completely dry before putting your glass on top of this kiln shelf. If there's still moisture on your kiln shelf, it will create steam, and that will also can cause devitrification or bubbles on the surface of your glass. As you can see, I'm going back to put my 3rd layer in. And this will be my last layer for this kiln shelf. When this plaster and water has dried on the kiln shelf, it actually creates a white powdery coat on the surface. All right, I still have enough water in my mix, so I'm going to use that now quickly to also apply it to my molds. So this is the one mold we'll be using, and it's the same process again. In this mold, you can actually see the plaster line due to the terracotta color of the clay that's been bisque fired. The more one does this, the more you will learn to know what you're looking for your final layering on top of your mold, because I can see already that I don't need to go back onto this, because otherwise it's going to be too much for this mold. So this is perfect application of your plaster water mix. I'm also going to apply it to the mold that we made, that Sarah made previously, and it will be the same process again. Oops. If the water and plaster mix gets too thick, rather clean that out and start again than using the thick plaster, because that's just going to create terrible lines on your glass. There we go. And now what I'm going to do, whilst these are drying, I'm going to ensure that I throw this down, not a drain, into a dustbin, because remember, plaster does block your drain, and wash your brush immediately, because if your plaster dries on your brush, you won't be able to use this again. Also ensure that your plaster has been sealed, that no water can come into this, because any moisture in the atmosphere will contaminate your plaster, that you also cannot use it. Hi everyone, I'm going to explain to you now the importance of prepping your kiln. One needs to ensure that the kiln is completely clean by vacuuming the inside, as well as going lightly over the elements to ensure that no dust or leftover plaster is sitting on the kiln elements or on the kiln bricks, as this dust can create devitrification again in our glass. So with glass, it's always important to make sure that the area is completely clean before putting our kiln shelf in and our glass in and switching the kiln program on. Oh, also another thing is to make sure that your glass is clean. Before placing it in the kiln, make sure you've washed it and you've dried it and that it's spotless and no dust is on it. I'm now going to vacuum just to show you. Our kiln has been vacuumed and ready for firing. This is our controller, and on our controller we put in our program, and you'll see we work with a little ramp system. Alright, so I'm going to first take you through the process and explain to you when the certain lights come up. So you'll see the first one at the moment is highlighted, is your first dot. In that dot, you'll see with these two little symbols here, you'll see a temperature and a clock. At the moment, just the clock is highlighted or displaying with a red dot. This means we are talking about time only. So for instance, if we want to delay our kiln firing, what we would do is, say for instance we wanted to only fire first thing when we come in the morning, we could have put a delay in there for 12 hours so that when we come in the morning it has started its firing process. Okay, we don't always use this, it's just there if you need it. Then we go again with our arrows and we go into our next program or next section within our program. Now you'll see the next dot is highlighted and you'll see that the time and temperature at the moment as well is shining with the red dots. This is now saying that we are talking about time and temperature. So how many degrees Celsius you want your program to go up according to your time. So if you wanted to go up 250 degrees an hour to 500, as an example, it will take 2 hours. Okay, then you go up to your next temperature. And you'll see we are just talking about temperature. So here, that was our time to get to our top temperature. So at the moment, you'll see the program is 680, but I'll take you through that step just now. So that is at the moment our temperature. Then we have our next dot that parallel is our, again, time only. So that is talking about a soaking point. So we can allow our glass to stay at a certain temperature. Next process, now we're ramping up again, if you can see by what the picture is showing here. So now again we are working with time and temperature. So the time we want it to take up with the temperature till we get to our top temperature. Okay, then we have again a delay. So it's the same process repeated. When we are on this process here, often one is able to open up the kiln. Anything above I would say 680 is fine to open up your kiln to see what's happening, but never allow your kiln to drop lower than 680. This going down is our crash cooling, so this will be able to help us to freeze our glass in that process that we have just seen in the kiln. And then we'll go down to a temperature we normally want to hold our glass, and then from this process we talk about annealing. So we want our glass to go down slowly, therefore that it doesn't crack. Again, we can have a delay of temperature, and then we could go down with our annealing slowly as possible, depending obviously on the thickness of the glass, until normally room temperature or 30 degrees, where we are able to open up the kiln. Now now going to explain to you the process of slumping. And this is now especially for Connie's piece, where she's going to be slumping over the mold we created, or Lebel's piece where we are slumping into that plate shape. What is important to remember when we are slumping is that the thicker your glass is, the more weight it has behind it, so the quicker it's going to drop into the mold. So when slumping, it is nice to work with at least between a 6 to an 8 ml glass to ensure that you get that lovely desired shape that you want at the bottom of the surface. All right. And remember, the thinner your glass is, the longer you're going to have to hold it at the top temperature, because it does not have gravity behind it. We're not going to delay it. We're going to start the process immediately, and we're going to take it up 200 degrees an hour, so still quite slow in glass, up to 580. Once again, 580 is our point. Anything below 580, our glass is fragile, so we need to make sure that we are quite delicate and with our glass in this process. I'm holding it for 20 minutes to ensure that my glass is all the same temperature, and not just my glass, I'm also want to ensure that my mold is also at 580 degrees. We are now ramping up to the top temperature, and I'm going to take it up 250 degrees an hour up to my top temperature, which is 680. At 680, our glass tends to start to move. So this is a nice temperature to use and hold the glass. If need be, and we need to hold the glass there, for instance, for an hour, half an hour, rather hold it at a lower temperature of 680 than trying to ramp it higher, because anything higher than 700, especially with float glass, we tend to get devitrification, that crystal layer on top. So if we can keep our top temperature lower than 700, we will be less chance of devit. So I'm going to hold my glass there for 30 minutes. One can also, in this process, especially with slumping, is just before you hit your 30 minutes, is just to peek open the lid of the kiln and double check that you are happy with your desired shape that you have. If you feel it has not completely slumped into the mold, rather quickly go back into your program and allow it to hold longer at that top temperature. We are then going to crash cool. So we want it to go as fast as possible down, because we are not manually doing this. We're allowing the kiln to do this process for us, down to 580. Again, this is where our glass starts to become fragile, and we want to make sure that our glass goes down slowly from this temperature. But first, we need to make sure that our glass is all the same temperature before annealing it down. I like to hold it for a longer period at 580 when slumping, because our glass and our mold will cool at different temperatures. It's important when we get to 580 to ensure that both are 580 before moving down slowly when we are going to anneal. I'm then going to anneal for 100 degrees an hour down to 30 degrees or room temperature when we can open the kiln lid. Okay, so now we're going to slump Connie's piece for her card design. We're now going to slump Connie's piece, her card holder. We've placed the clear piece of glass on top of her mold, which has got its plaster release on it. We'll paint the design after it's been slumped. The program is in. Our top temperature is 680. I'm going to close the kiln with a little bit open, and I'm going to start the program. And when the kiln program is reading 100 degrees, I will close the kiln completely. Reason for leaving it open is to make sure that if any moisture is inside the kiln, that it's able to escape.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to sandblast the slumped piece. This slumped piece is for a card holder, and I'm going to sandblast the back just to get rid of that devitrification the glass went through, because there's some crystallization that happened. That's devitrification. Right, Safety first is always to wear a mask while sandblasting. It's very dangerous. You don't want to breathe in all that sand that's going to come about into the room. This is the sandblaster. This is our door. Inside our door, this is where we place our glass on top of this wooden thing. And here are our gloves that we put our arms through, and the gun is over there. Alright? So when we close the door, we make sure everything is airtight. We work in this space over here. We put our arms through here, and the gun is, we hold the gun which is inside. Now I'm going to switch on the machine over here, and this little knob over here is for the light. Okay, now we know that's how we switch on. Now we're going to put our mask on. And now I'm going to start sandblasting. So you put your glass in. Make sure everything is closed. Switch on the first knob, which is the motor. The second knob for the light. There's a pedal at the bottom of this machine where you have to press down to release the pressure for the sandblaster to work. So press onto the calibrator to release that pressure. The pressure for the sand to push out. Alright. I have my glass, my foot is in position already, and I just start pressing down. Hello everyone, today I'm going to show you how to do a general painting techniques for the designs that is required. The first thing I'm going to show you is a little sample piece of glass. We're going to do all the wet and dry applications on this piece of glass just to show you the general applications. First of all, PPE. It's very important to wear your gloves. We must wear our gloves because the chemicals in the paint are quite poisonous. It contains lead, and if you're pregnant, I would suggest not to work with these paints at all. Alright, now you must wear your mask so you can protect yourself from breathing in all these dangerous chemicals when you're doing a dry application or wet application. And it's also very important to work in a well-ventilated area. Alright, so now we are going to use dry application technique, and the tools that we'll need is a sieve. And the colors that we'll use is a yellow brown, and an orange. This is just to create a nice little sunset feel. When working with enamels, it's important to know which temperatures that you are working with. So at the moment I'm using high temp enamels, but the application is exactly the same for low temperature enamels. It's just when it comes to painting with these different temperatures, the texture of the paint differs. So for low temperatures, the paint texture is a lot harsher and a lot crispier. And for high temp enamels, the paint texture becomes a lot softer and a lot smoother. All right. Now for the dry application, we have our sieve. and we have a spatula. We use a spatula just to pick up our enamel and to apply it into a sieve, and we're just gonna sieve it onto our glass. Alright, it's also important to work on a clean surface or on top of a piece of paper so you don't mess and all that excess can just fall onto the paper. Alright, so we're just going to tap a certain area. And just repeat this process. Just to make sure you get an even coating. The tricky parts are on the edges, because we tend to think that they are all coated, but they're actually not. And we just repeat the same process with the other colors. Come in with our yellow brown. And we apply under our orange. You can overlap the colors slightly, and that's just how we get that that blend of colors that the sunset has. Right, and then we work our way backwards. That is our sunset dry application. You can use the sieving technique in various ways. You can also create a stencil for yourself with different designs, different patterns. You place it on your glass and you just sieve on that stencil. You can just remove the stencil and you have a beautiful dry application of enamels. All right, now this is a sample piece of what we basically just did. And it is a 2-layer piece of glass, and the enamel is fused between those 2 sheets of glass. This sample is for Amo's jewelry piece. It has a sunset design, and that is basically what I just showed you. It's also very important to remember that high temp enamels can be fused between 2 sheets of glass, and it can be applied on the surface of the glass. However, low temp enamels can only be applied on the top layer of glass and not between, because that requires to go to a higher temperature. Okay, now that we've done our dry application, I'm going to show you how to do a wet application. The tools that we'll need is our spatula, so you make sure that's clean. Always have some paper, just to always keep your tools clean. Here are our brushes, our enamel paint, which is a high temperature of black, and our painting medium, and our water. And for certain techniques, it's always nice to have a little needle with a little bit of a spatula, small spatula. Right. Oh, and our sieve again. Okay, the first step is to sieve our enamel paint into our working palette, which is this block of glass over here. It's always nice or important to work in small samples of paint. Then you can always come back and add more. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, good.
So we are sieving our enamel through, just to get rid of these little bumps or clumps. And just smooth that out. Then we just create a little hole in the middle. Then we take our painting medium. The painting medium helps the enamel to stick to the glass. If you just use water, the consistency of the paint tends to fade out. And we would like our colors to be solid. So if we use lots of water, you're going to have a very light, watered down texture on your glass. So I just scoop a little bit of medium into our little hole. Then we're just going to grind and smooth that out, mix it through. The consistency that we're looking for is, it's not too runny and it's not too thick. So it's almost like a gouache consistency if you've worked with gouache paint. And to compare it to something, it's almost like medicine, like cough syrup consistency. All right, this painting technique on how to do a wet application is exactly the same for all paints. So that's your high and low temps. All right, now I come in with a brush. Let's use, let's use this one and a nice big one. All right, I'm just going to wet our brush in some water. I'm just going to lift our enamels from the palette. So I'm just going to gather as much as I can onto the brush. And I'm going to now explain the different applications with the wet enamels. So the first one is a dabbing technique where you want a solid texture. So you're basically flooding the paint. And then our next application can be just a stroke. So you get a bit of a brush texture. You add more water into your brush. Paint will flow, will fade out a little bit at the end. Every time you move back into the paint gets lifted up back into the paintbrush. So it's always important to have one stroke of the application with your paintbrush. Otherwise it lifts back if you paint back and forth. But that also depends on the texture and the technique that you are looking for. All right. And then we have another technique I can show you. We have a big brush. Let's give it some water. just lift that all up. I'm just gonna go straight across, just so that you can see the texture of the paintbrush. When you lift the glass up, you can start to see the texture from the paintbrush. So you have the one application where you're dabbing and letting the paint flood. Then you have the other technique where you can just brush it through. All right, there's another technique that you can use. When the paint is dry, you can take a needle and you can scratch back into your paint. You can't see it now, but when it is dry, it leaves the exposure of the glass, so you can create really fine detail into your paintings. Yeah. So you can also use a needle to redefine or define your edges a bit more and to add in a lot of detail. There's a lot of techniques that you can use, just like in normal painting on a canvas. You can apply those same techniques onto glass. So if you want to dab, you may dab. It will end up looking like that. It all depends on you.
I'm now going to discuss the low temp enamel firing. This temperature ranges between about 540 to 580. So just keep in mind to always do test pieces beforehand to make sure you found your desired firing top temperature point before starting your final piece. My top temperature with this will go up to 580. First, our delay. We do not need a delay, so we're going to pass that section. And we're going to take our glass up 200 degrees an hour, up to 300. And why 300 is because I'm actually going to pass the section. I'll explain that now. So once I get to 300, I'm actually going to put in no delay here. So it's actually going to go through 300, past that, and it's going to go up exactly the same temperature again. Let me just double check. Yes, I'm going to bring it up then 250 degrees, so slightly faster, up to my top temperature, which is going to be 580. Okay, so I didn't take my time at 300 because I don't need a delay there. Our glass is at quite a critical point. It's got a lot of tension there, so we're rather going to pass through and we're going to keep ramping up, but at a slightly faster degree temperature, up to 580. And then we're going to hold it there for 15 minutes to ensure that our glass powder enamel paint has made proper contact with our glass surface and has they don't fuse together because it's not high enough temperature, but has melted on top of the glass and has made permanent contact. We are then going to, now we're not going to crash cool with this process, reason being because we're already at 580. So what we're going to do is we're going to say full, but we're going to cheat the system by confusing it and saying we're going back to 580. So we initially actually just staying exactly the same temperature where we were. And because of that, we there don't need to hold our process there because we're already at 580 and we held it at the top for 15 degrees. So what we're basically already doing here, we are starting the annealing process, 15 minutes at the top temperature. And therefore we are going to slowly process, we are actually annealing already from the top because we have skipped that middle section there. And then we are going to put in our annealing, which I like to work with, is normally 100 degrees an hour until 30 degrees, and we're allowed to open at room temperature depending on our outer environment.